After a massive deep dive, I'm finally ready to give you my take on the JFK assassination. Lone Gunman or conspiracy? I'm not here to rehash the Pruder film frame by frame or argue bullet trajectories. Instead, we're going to do a deep dive on the main people in this case. Because in the end, this case comes down to human beings, motives, and what they were actually capable of. We'll look at Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, two deeply flawed guys, desperate to matter, and whether they could or would have done this completely alone. I'll also go into the former CIA director, Allen Dulles, and the chief of the counterintelligence, James Angleton. And I'll also look at the Israeli angle and ask, would any of them ever take a huge risk of trying to plot anything with Oswald or Ruby? I'll also break down some of the biggest theories, like the possibility of another shooter from the Grassy Knoll. I held off posting until the latest document releases came out, and I'm not surprised there's no smoking gun. If this was a real conspiracy, nobody competent is going to write it down or record it. Nixon's presidential downfall was because he had his phone calls recorded, and that came back to bite him in the ass. Any big pieces of evidence, if there was any, was destroyed in November or December of 1963. For instance, Oswald had sent a threatening note to the FBI 10 days before the assassination, and it got flushed down the toilet the second he was shot. Not to hide the plot necessarily, but to cover incompetence. So if they do release anything in the future, it's always going to be something that's circumstantial. I've gone through the Warren report, and yes, Dulles was on it, but it's still loaded with a lot of good primary sources. Many of the young lawyers and people on it admitted they were trying their best to find out who did it, because that would be a huge boost for their careers. Could you imagine if you were like the lawyer or the academic or detective who solved JFK? I also read The Devil's Chessboard, which is about Dulles and the CIA, and hours of episodes on the Sixth Floor Museum YouTube channel, which has a lot of good information and debates and plenty of other things. So let's start with Lee Harvey Oswald's life. So Oswald was pretty young when this all went down. He had just turned 24 the month before he was killed. In his short adult life, he was in the Marines for 3 years, lived in the Soviet Union for almost 3 years, was married and had 2 young kids. He lived in Dallas and New Orleans, and then tried to move to Cuba or even back to the Soviet Union. He also had a failed assassination attempt of U.S. Major General Edwin Walker, which I think is very important. So Oswald was born on October 18th, 1939 in New Orleans, 2 months after his father died. Raised by an overworked, emotionally distant mother, Marguerite, he lived in extreme instability, 22 homes and 12 schools by age 17. He spent time in an orphanage as a toddler. He briefly had a stepfather whom he liked, but he left after a few years. He was often left at home from an early age. His mother sometimes locked him in the house or left him in the car while she worked, and she discouraged him from playing with other kids. Lee showed extreme social withdrawal, refused to play with other children, had no friends, and preferred complete isolation. In 1952, when he was about 12, he moved to New York City. Severe truancy and behavioral problems led to 3 weeks in a juvenile detention facility for psychiatric evaluation. He was diagnosed with personality pattern disturbance and schizoid features and passive-aggressive tendencies. Psychiatrists described intense emotional deprivation, vivid violent power fantasies, and a sense that nobody ever met his needs for love. He told evaluators he disliked everybody, wanted no friends, and felt a veil between himself and others that he preferred to keep intact. So by the time he's 12, he's probably pretty ruined. His mother rejected ongoing treatment recommendations. The family abruptly returned to New Orleans in 1954. Lee remained alienated, got bullied in school, so he quit school after 9th grade and later joined the Marines. Neighbors and others who knew him at that time recall an introverted boy who read a great deal, which later turned more into communist or Marxist literature. One of his fellow employees, Palmer McBride, stated that Oswald said he would like to kill President Eisenhower because he was exploiting the working class. Oswald praised Khrushchev and suggested that he and McBride join the Communist Party to take advantage of their social functions, but there weren't any in New Orleans at that time. Despite the fact that he didn't like America, he wanted to join the Marines for a couple reasons. One was because his older brother Robert had done so approximately 3 years before, and because he wanted to get away from his surroundings and from his mother. Just like in New York, he didn't make any meaningful relationships in New Orleans or like it there, and it's no surprise that he wouldn't end up liking the Marines either. Although his military record showed no signs of mental instability, he had difficulty adjusting to life in the Marine Corps. Despite qualifying for promotion, he remained a private first class, largely due to his poor attitude towards authority. Oswald believed himself to be highly intelligent and capable, and saw many of his superiors as incompetent. He often tried to challenge officers by provoking debates on foreign affairs, a topic he had studied extensively. When they couldn't match his knowledge, he saw them as unworthy of commanding him. His behavior appears to have been driven by a desire to draw attention to himself and affirm his inflated self-image. Carrie Thornley, a fellow Marine, testified that Oswald had a defiant personality, often behaving in ways that were deliberately sloppy or disruptive. He believed Oswald saw trouble and then used the resulting discipline to portray himself as a victim. While stationed in Japan, Oswald managed to get a girlfriend for the first time. This boost in confidence made him cockier and more reckless. One night he accidentally spilled a drink in a sergeant, then immediately challenged the guy to a fight. He later claimed he was drunk and that the sergeant had it in for him. The spill was ruled accidental, but Oswald was still convicted of using provocative words and spent 28 days in the brig. This wasn't even his first court-martial. Earlier, he'd illegally carried a pistol and managed to shoot himself in the arm with it and got another round of confinement. So the base he was at, Atsugi, was a major CIA hub for U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union, which has fueled endless theories that Oswald was recruited by intelligence right then and there. But there's no agency that's going to recruit a guy who's picking fights with sergeants and literally shooting himself in the elbow. Despite the trouble, Oswald requested and received an early discharge in September 1959, 3 months ahead of schedule, officially to care for his mother who'd been injured at work. By this point, he was openly obsessed with Marxism. He taught himself Russian, bragged about the Soviet system, and told fellow Marines he wanted to be on the right side of history. A guy people would still be talking about in 10,000 years. So barely 5 weeks after leaving the Corps, he boarded a ship and defected to the Soviet Union, telling anyone who'd listen that America was an exploitive capitalist hellhole that deserved to be overthrown. He arrived in Moscow at the end of October 1959 on a 7-day tourist visa. Through his local government guide, he immediately announced he wanted Soviet citizenship and wished to renounce his American passport. When officials told him on the day his visa expired that his application was denied and he had to leave that night, Oswald went back to his hotel room and slit his left wrist in the bathtub. This wound was superficial but bloody enough to buy him a week in the Moscow hospital under psychiatric observation. After that, the Soviets decided they didn't want him as a citizen, but they would let him stay. They sent him 1,200 miles west to Minsk, Belarus. In Minsk, he was given a job as a machinist at a radio and television factory, a rent-free apartment, and a monthly stipend, which was generous when you compare it to locals of his age and profession. To a 21-year-old, it might have seemed decent, but there was nowhere to spend the money anyway. It's not like there was bowling alleys and nightclubs to go to. And so Oswald began to dislike it there. He hated the compulsory political meetings, the forced volunteer farm work, and the petty privileges enjoyed by party officials. His diary entries grew bitter. As my Russian improves, I become increasingly conscious of just what sort of society I am in. I've had enough. By early 1961, less than 18 months after arriving, he contacted the U.S. Embassy about coming home. In March 1961, he met 19-year-old Marina Prusakova at a Minsk dance. 6 weeks later, they were married. Their first daughter, June, was born in February 1962. And in June 1962, after 2.5 years abroad, Oswald, Marina, and the baby June headed to Texas. So even though he said he would live in the Soviet Union forever, he was back in less than 3 years, so his experiment was a failure. He was returning to a place he never wanted to go back to and admitted that capitalism and communism were both horrible, and he didn't want to live in either. There's no evidence that has been found that the Soviet Union used him for any particular propaganda or other political or informational purposes. Obviously, when he slit his wrist is probably when they knew they couldn't take him seriously, which is why they sent him to a factory where he would eventually get bored and want to go back home. The homecoming was rough. Oswald was moody, irritable, and convinced the FBI was watching him. He bounced through a series of low-skill jobs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He was a sheet metal worker, a photographer, lab technician, etc., and was repeatedly fired for poor performance, reading communist newspapers at work, or simply not getting along with people. The Russian immigrant community in Dallas tried to help Marina and the baby, but Oswald resented their charity and eventually cut off most contact. He had told one of the Russians that, "I didn't find what I was looking for in the Soviet Union," and it was thought he became disgusted with life in the Soviet Union as the novelty of his presence of an American wore off, and he began to be less of the center of attention. His wife told the Russian community that everybody in Russia hated him, so it wasn't a surprise they weren't a big fan of him either. In late March 1963, Oswald mail-ordered a rifle and a .38 revolver under the alias A. Hidell. He had planned several weeks to assassinate retired Major General Edwin A. Walker, an outspoken right-wing anti-communist and segregationist. On the night of April 10th, 1963, Oswald crept up to Walker's house in Dallas and fired a single shot through the window while Walker sat at his desk. The bullet deflected off the wooden window frame, and Walker was hit only by fragments in his forearm, but it was close. Oswald had left Marina a note explaining what to do if he was killed or captured, along with photos of himself holding the rifle and copies of The Worker and The Militant. When he confessed the attempt to Marina later that night, she made him promise never to do it again and forced him to destroy most of the evidence. I think this is one of the most important events in his life, which shows that he was willing to go to jail or die at that point. And this time was only about 6 months before he shot at JFK. So if he was willing to do this on this occasion, I think it's fair that he might do something like this again, especially if the opportunity presented itself, like a president driving in front of your work, for instance. Unemployed again, Oswald left Marina with a friend, Ruth Payne, and moved to New Orleans in late April 1963. He found temporary work greasing coffee roasting machines, then decided to become a one-man pro-Castro activist. Ignoring advice from the National Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he printed leaflets that said, "Hands off Cuba." He also created fake membership cards and set up the non-existent New Orleans chapter. He got into scuffles with anti-Castro Cuban exiles, was arrested once, and managed to get himself on a local radio and TV debating Cuba policy. When a host revealed he had lived in the Soviet Union, his credibility collapsed. Although Oswald said he had recruited up to 35 people, the only person in his organization was himself. By midsummer, he was out of work again. Marina was pregnant with their second child, and the family had almost no money. One night, he broke down crying and told Marina he wanted to go back to the Soviet Union, anywhere that at least guaranteed a job and a roof. He even talked about hijacking a plane to go to Cuba because he had worked inside an aircraft before in the Marines, but he had no idea how to fly one. Luckily, his wife talked him out of that. At the end of September, Oswald sent his family back to Irving, Texas with their friend Ruth Payne, and then he took a bus to Mexico City. His goal was to get a Cuban tourist transit visa, but they told him he would need to get a visa from the USSR if that was his intended final destination. Over several frantic days, he stormed the Cuban and Soviet embassies, waving his fair play for Cuba clippings, old Soviet documents, and newspaper stories about his arrest in New Orleans. The Cuban consul remembered him shouting and slamming papers on the desks and actually had to kick him out in the end. At the Soviet consulate, he reportedly became so agitated that he may have shown or placed a revolver on the counter. Both embassies told him it would take months, if ever, to get these visas. Defeated and furious, he returns to Texas on October 3rd. So around the time of Oswald's trip to Mexico City, two Marxist publications he subscribed to, The Militant and The Worker, routinely lambasted Kennedy's hardline economic measures against Cuba, such as the suffocating trade embargo and sabotage efforts, which they saw as outright bullying of the revolution. This aligns with Oswald's own worldview, as evidenced by his diary and letters, where he echoed these publications, anti-Kennedy sentiments on Cuba, and other issues. So although he hated the right wing more, he was also opposed to Kennedy, who was bullying Cuba. Back in Dallas, he rented a tiny room in Oak Cliff under the alias O.H. Lee and visited Marina on weekends. He got a temporary job at the Texas School Book Depository, filling school book orders. A pure coincidence that the building sat on the upcoming presidential motorcade route. FBI agents visited Ruth Payne's house twice looking for him and chatted with his wife. Oswald stormed into the FBI office and left that angry note I mentioned that was later destroyed. On Thursday night, November 21st, he made an unusual midweek visit to the Payne house and begged Marina to find an apartment so they could live together again. But she refused. That night, he left his wedding ring and $170 in cash in an envelope on the dresser and took $14 with him when he left. The next morning, he left the rooming house carrying a long package he told his coworker was curtain rods, which was obviously the rifle. He arrived at the Texas School Book Depository, carried the package inside, and went about his usual job, filling book orders. Just after noon, he was seen calmly drinking a Coke in the second-floor lunchroom. Minutes later, 3 shots rang out from the 6th-floor southeast window. President Kennedy was struck twice, and Governor Connally once. Within 90 seconds of the final shot, a police officer confronted Oswald in the lunchroom with his gun drawn. The building superintendent vouched that he worked there, and Oswald was allowed to walk out the front door. He boarded a bus, but abandoned it because it was so much traffic, and then took a taxi to his house, where he changed into a jacket and grabbed his .38 revolver. A short while later, while walking through Oak Cliff, he was stopped by patrolman J.D. Tippett. I imagine he looked really nervous and was walking super fast. After a brief exchange, Oswald drew the revolver and shot Tippett 4 times, killing him in front of several witnesses. He then went into the Texas Theater without buying a ticket. Police swarmed the theater, and when they moved in, Oswald fought back, punching an officer and trying to shoot another before he was finally subdued. As he was dragged out, he shouted that he was being subjected to police brutality. For the next 2 days, he was interrogated repeatedly by the Dallas police, the FBI, and the Secret Service. No lawyer was present and nothing was recorded. He denied shooting anyone, Kennedy, Connally, or Tippett, and insisted he had been eating lunch on the first floor when the president was killed. To the press crowded in the hallways, he declared, "I'm just a patsy." He tried several times to reach a leftist New York attorney, John Abt, but the calls were never put through. On Sunday morning, November 24th, police prepared to transfer him to the county jail. In the basement garage, surrounded by reporters and television cameras broadcasting it live to the nation, Jack Ruby suddenly stepped forward and fired a single .38 caliber bullet into Oswald's abdomen. He was rushed to Parkland Hospital, the same emergency room where Kennedy had died 45 hours earlier, and was pronounced dead a short time later. Reporters said his last words were a faint protest that nobody was going to shoot him. Marina and his mother identified the body, and he was buried the next day in a modest Fort Worth cemetery. Because so few people attended, reporters helped carry the casket. Lee Harvey Oswald was 24 years old and had died without ever being tried or convicted for the assassination of President Kennedy. So by looking at his life, you could definitely see he was capable of doing something like this, especially if the situation presented itself. He was at the end of a lifetime of failures. He was a failed Marine, failed defector, failed husband, failed activist, failed assassin of General Walker, and now an accused assassin of a president who only had $13.87 in his pocket and no realistic plans or means of escape. The conclusion in the Warren report stated that Lee Harvey Oswald was profoundly alienated from the world in which he lived. His life was characterized by isolation, frustration, and failure. He had very few, if any, close relationships with other people, and he appeared to have great difficulty in finding a meaningful place in the world. I think that's pretty accurate, and I'll give more thoughts about that at the end. So now let's look a little bit about Jack Ruby's life. Born Jacob Leon Rubenstein in Chicago in 1911 to Polish Jewish American immigrants, he had a rough childhood. He had an alcoholic and violent father, a mentally unstable mother. He was sent to foster homes and juvenile court by age 11. He never finished high school. In the 1930s, he was a small-time hustler in Chicago, selling tip sheets at racetracks, running union errands, some tied to the Capone outfit, and dabbling in minor gambling. He changed his name to Jack Ruby around 1940 when he moved to Dallas with his sister Ava. In World War II, he was drafted into the Army Air Forces, served stateside as an aircraft mechanic, and was honorably discharged in 1946. He returned to Dallas in 1947, and with his brothers and sisters, took over a series of failing nightclubs. By the late 1950s, he owned the Carousel Club, a second-tier strip joint on Commerce Street downtown. Burlesque dancers, cheap food, loud music, and a reputation for rowdy crowds. Ruby was the classic, overdressed, loud, sentimental nightclub owner, always in a suit and fedora, handing out business cards that read, "Jack Ruby, your friend." He was quick to cry at sad movies, devoted to his dogs, and known for punching out drunks and anyone who insulted the girls. He was close with the police. He often hung out at their headquarters, slipped cops free drinks and passes to the club, and bragged that he knew every officer in Dallas. Ruby had some mob connections in Dallas, New Orleans, and even tried to open a club in Havana, but he was never a major player. The FBI had a thin file on him as a small-time gambler and associate of hoodlums, but he was never a made guy or a major player. Temperamental, heavily in debt, and addicted to amphetamines, he was never married and lived alone in a messy apartment filled with guns and dogs. So the summer and fall of 1963 was one long downward spiral for Ruby. His club, the Carousel, was losing money. Two rival clubs with better strippers were killing his business. He owed a ton of money to the IRS, and they were threatening to close his club down. I'll go more into his financial situation in a minute. He idolized President Kennedy, and especially Jackie Kennedy. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, he told friends he wished someone would shoot that Castro. When Kennedy's Dallas trip was announced, Ruby was excited. He even tried, but failed to get press credentials through a friendly reporter. So on November 22nd, Ruby was at the Dallas Morning News building placing his weekly club ad when he heard the shots over a reporter's radio. He broke down crying, closed his club for the weekend, which was unheard of for him, and spent the day wandering between the newspaper, police headquarters, and the synagogue, which he rarely went to, but only when he was having hard times. Over Friday night and into Saturday, he kept showing up uninvited at police press conferences, correcting reporters' mistakes, handing out sandwiches and soft drinks to newsmen, and standing only a few feet from Oswald during the midnight press showing. He carried a loaded snub-nosed .38 in his coat pocket the whole time. On Saturday night, he became obsessed with the idea that Jews were going to be blamed for the assassination. He called his sister Ava in Chicago, crying that they were going to blame the Jews for this, and people were already complaining about them. So on Sunday morning, November 24th, Ruby woke up agitated because a stripper had called him for $25, so he took his favorite dog and drove downtown to send that money order to his stripper, who needed it for rent. He arrived at the Western Union office on Main Street, which is only 1 block from police headquarters. The receipt of his Western Union payment was stamped at 11:17. So Oswald's transfer to the county jail was originally scheduled for 10 a.m., but had been delayed. So he walks down Main Street, down the ramp into the police basement just as Oswald was being let out, and he fires a single shot to his abdomen at 11:21. Ruby later died in prison of cancer in January of 1967, still insisting he acted alone and on impulse. Ruby said he did this because he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the ordeal of a trial and showing the world the Jews have guts. Although he claims it's mostly about sparing her a trial, I think the largest problem was his financial problem, which wasn't going to get any better. Jack Ruby's financial situation in November 1963 was disastrous, one of the worst periods of his life, and people close to him openly were worried that he was on the verge of total collapse. As I mentioned, he owed the IRS over $44,000 in back cabaret taxes, exercise taxes, and income tax liens, which is about $500,000 in today's money. The IRS had already seized his bank accounts twice in 1963 and was threatening to padlock the Carousel Club any week. He was 3 to 4 months behind on rent for the Carousel and for his apartment. The club itself was losing money fast. Gross receipts have dropped from roughly $1,200 to $1,500 a week in the late 50s to under $500 some weeks in 1963 because the two bigger, flashier clubs, Abe Weinstein's Colony Club and Barney Weinstein's Theater Lounge, had taken most of the convention and oil men trade. He was borrowing from loan sharks at 10 to 20% a week and bouncing checks all over Dallas. His bank balance on November 22nd was $184.97, and he had written several bad checks that hadn't cleared yet. He owed the American Guild of Variety Artists thousands in unpaid dancer commissions and was facing a union strike that would have closed him down. He was sending desperate telegrams and making frantic calls to creditors literally days before the assassination, begging for extensions. Friends and employees described him in November 1963 as completely broke, at the end of his rope, and popping 50 to 60 Prelude tablets a day just to keep on going. One of the strippers testified that he cried in the dressing room the week before the assassination because he couldn't make payroll. He was borrowing from loan sharks and getting threatening phone calls. Heavy amphetamine use left him paranoid, weepy, and erratic. Friend noticed he was talking to himself and pacing for hours. His lawyer, who saw his books, later said Ruby was functionally bankrupt and that the Carousel would have been shuttered by the IRS or the landlord within weeks if the assassination hadn't happened. So when Ruby walked into the police basement on November 24th, he was not a man with money problems. He was a man who, in his own mind and on paper, had already lost everything except his dogs and the suit on his back. So of course he was pissed at Lee Harvey Oswald. Having JFK assassinated wasn't going to help the economy or his business. Following the assassination, roughly 60 to 70% of scheduled conventions for the next 6 to 9 months canceled within days. Hotel occupancy in downtown Dallas dropped 25 to 40% in December of 1963 and January of 1964 compared with the year before. Retail sales in downtown department stores fell 10 to 20% during the 1963 Christmas season. Many shoppers simply avoided the city. Editorials called Dallas the city of hate or the hate capital. Travel agents reported clients asking things like, "Is it safe to change planes in Dallas?" Some companies quietly moved regional offices or sales meetings elsewhere. So by spring, things started to come back, but that would have been way too late. The JFK assassination was the nail in the coffin for Jack Ruby and his club. So let's go into Allen Dulles. He was the longest serving director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the most influential American spy master of the Cold War. He was born on April 7th, 1893 in Watertown, New York, into one of America's great established families. His grandfather and uncle both served as a Secretary of State. His older brother, John Foster Dulles, would become Eisenhower's Secretary of State. He got his bachelor's and master's at Princeton, did a brief stint teaching English in India, and then joined the diplomatic service in 1916. He was posted to Vienna and Bern during the war, and there he learned the craft of espionage, recruitment, and code breaking on the job. He got his law degree at George Washington University in 1926. He joined the Wall Street firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which was his brother's firm, specializing in international finance, and became the classic Wall Street lawyer with a passport. In the 1930s, he traveled constantly in Europe, watched Hitler's rise firsthand, and quietly fed information to the State Department. In World War II, he's recruited into the Office of Strategic Services, which was a precursor of the CIA. Stationed in Bern again, he built the most successful Allied intelligence operation of the war from 1942 to 1945. After the war, he returned briefly to law practice. He was first the Deputy Director of Intelligence and later was appointed by Eisenhower in February of 1953 as the director. He ran the agency for almost 9 years, which is the longest tenure in CIA history. His era was the agency's golden age of covert action. So he did many things during this time. In 1953 and 1954, he orchestrated coups to overthrow the government in Iran and Guatemala, and later several other countries. He developed the U-2 spy program and the Corona satellite program, expanded paramilitary capabilities, and created the executive action, which is basically the assassination capability. Personally obsessed with Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, authorized multiple assassination plots by trying to poison cigars, exploding seashells, mafia hitmen, etc. He pushed the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. When it collapsed, Kennedy reportedly said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Dulles was forced out in November 1961. But even after his forced resignation, Allen Dulles never left the CIA. He kept a contract consultant role, an office, and secure phone at the headquarters into the late 60s. He stayed actively involved in Cuba operations, mongoose assassination plots through 1963. He regularly met with top CIA officers, Helms, Angleton, Fitzgerald, who treated him as the real boss behind the scenes. He also continued receiving classified briefings and giving advice on major programs until his death in 1969. So although he was officially gone, unofficially, he remained one of the most influential figures inside Langley for the rest of his life. Following Kennedy's death, he was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to the Warren Commission investigating JFK's assassination, which was widely criticized as a blatant conflict of interest given the CIA's recent history with Kennedy and Cuba. He left behind a mixed record: a brilliant wartime operative, architect of early Cold War covert successes, but also was the man most responsible for the CIA's overreach, secrecy, and ultimate humiliation at the Bay of Pigs. So the biggest reason conspiracy researchers zero in on Allen Dulles is simple. He had both a personal grudge and a major ideological clash with Kennedy. JFK had publicly humiliated and fired Dulles, along with his deputies Bissell and Cabell, after the Bay of Pigs debacle, which was the worst failure of Dulles' career. Dulles never forgave him, and his friends later said he considered Kennedy naive, weak, and dangerously soft on communism. Policy-wise, the gap was huge. Dulles was the ultimate Cold War hawk who believed in covert coups and rolling back communism everywhere, especially in Cuba. Kennedy burned by the Bay of Pigs, became far more cautious, vetoed CIA assassination plots against Castro, and started looking for detente with Khrushchev and back-channel talks with Fidel Castro. Dulles was an old-guard Republican. Kennedy was a younger Democrat who openly distrusted the CIA's invisible government. But JFK wasn't the only person he disagreed with on politics. He had a lot of issues with FDR, for instance. He viewed the New Deal as borderline socialistic, resented the heavy regulation of banks and corporations, and disliked the recognition of the Soviet Union in 1933. He believed FDR had been naive about Soviet intentions and was so physically and mentally weakened by 1945 that it allowed Stalin to dominate negotiations. In private conversations and later writings, he blamed Roosevelt and Algiers Hiss, whom he detested, for giving away Eastern Europe and for the post-war Soviet advantage in intelligence. Dulles thought Roosevelt was a great war leader and an inspiring figure to the country, but he never really understood the Bolsheviks. He thought he could charm Stalin the way he charmed voters. So he had some gratitude for what he accomplished during the wartime and public respect, but a lifelong ideological distrust and a firm belief FDR had been dangerously soft on communism, both before and at the end of the war. And remember that there weren't any term limits of presidents until after Roosevelt died. They changed it to 2 terms because Roosevelt was in his 4th term when he died of natural causes. So in theory, FDR could have been president for a much longer time if he was younger. So Kennedy at that time he was assassinated was in the last year of his 1st term. And I could assume he would win re-election, but in total, it's really only 5 years he's going to be in office. Is it really that detrimental? Although he wasn't as hawkish on Cuba as Dulles wanted, he had already brought troops into Vietnam and other areas, so I don't see why it would be such a big deal to get rid of him. And there were other ways of ruining JFK's chances of re-election that next year. From the late 1950s onward, both the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA under James Angleton maintained extensive classified files on Kennedy's extramarital affairs because several of the women were viewed as potential security risks. Hoover routinely sent Kennedy summaries or veiled threats. Mr. President, we have information that might interest the press, and shared the raw materials with Angleton. Angleton treated the president's sex life as a counterintelligence problem, kept his own thick file, and used it to monitor possible Soviet or Cuban blackmail attempts. By 1963, the 2 agencies together had a detailed cross-reference dossier that documented dozens of encounters, far more than the public ever learned during Kennedy's lifetime. So why wouldn't Dulles or Angleton drop some of this information to the press prior to the next election? Although affairs aren't that big of a deal today, maybe, it almost cost Clinton his presidency in the 90s. So in the 60s, it would be a huge deal if they published something like him sleeping with Marilyn Monroe, for instance. During his time as CIA director, Dulles oversaw operations that ended or crippled the political careers of at least 8 to 10 major foreign leaders without assassinating them in places like Iran, Guatemala, the Congo, Egypt, Vietnam, Indonesia, France, and even in the States like Joseph McCarthy. Dulles killed far more political careers than he did bodies. So why wouldn't he do that with Kennedy? There were 100 smarter, safer ways to ruin him politically. Leaks, scandals, fabricated evidence, without ever risking a public assassination. Allen Dulles spent decades playing geopolitical chess against the Soviets, the Chinese, and half the planet. He was 70 years old and in the final chapter of his life. And whether you like him or not, he was a pretty brilliant guy. The idea that he would stake his legacy on a mentally unstable loner who's an erratic ex-Marine with a $12 mail order rifle, who had no money and no getaway plan and no backup. He wasn't even an elite marksman. He had never fired at a moving target under pressure. He was shooting from a building full of his coworkers who could have walked in. And he could have hit an innocent bystander. He had hit Governor Connolly. What if he accidentally hit Jackie Kennedy? Or some other kids that were walking around? So I don't know if someone that intelligent like Dulles would do something like collaborate with someone as risky as Oswald. And I doubt he would do something like that just because he got fired. I doubt this guy is that thin-skinned. And he was already working behind the scenes anyway, so I don't think that's a motive either. People get fired when different administrations happen all the time. So let's take a look at Angleton. James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence from 1954 to 1974, had one of the most intimate and influential relationships with Israeli intelligence agencies of any American official during the Cold War. This bond, which began in the early 1950s and lasted until his ouster in 1974, was personal, operational, and ideological. Angleton, a non-Jew and anti-communist, became known among Israelis as the biggest Zionist of the lot. And that comes from a former Mossad director. He was a friend you could trust on a personal basis, said Itzhak Rabin, who was later a president. He is honored with 2 memorials in Israel, including Jim Angleton's Corner near Jerusalem's King David Hotel. From 1951, Angleton personally managed the CIA's Israeli desk, establishing a formal intelligence sharing channel with Mossad and Shin Bet. He met frequently with their leaders, sometimes weekly, exchanging highly sensitive data on Soviet activities, Arab states, and global threats. This included using Israeli agents for proxy operations, such as obtaining Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 anti-Stalin speech transcript, which embarrassed the USSR. JFK aggressively opposed Israel's nuclear ambitions, so he was against the Dimona nuclear reactor that they were building at the time. He demanded inspections in 1963 to letters to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and his successor Levi Eshkol. He threatened to cut out U.S. aid if Israel didn't allow International Atomic Energy Agency oversight, viewing it as a proliferation risk. Angleton, who had shielded Dimona since the late 1950s, allegedly saw this as an existential threat to Israel. Angleton covertly aided Dimona's nuclear weapons project. He overlooked Israeli theft of U.S. nuclear materials, like uranium smuggling from Pennsylvania plants, and blocked internal CIA investigations into Israel's program. Declassified files show he ran secret projects with Israeli operatives, often without congressional or full CIA oversight. Angleton viewed Israel as a bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East and a valuable proxy for U.S. spying. Examples include Mossad providing CIA intel from Cuba and joint counterterrorism efforts. He also provided Israeli interests, such as downplaying the 1967 USS Liberty attack, which was an Israeli attack on a U.S. ship, which he said was a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake. Newly declassified FBI and CIA files from 2025 reveal Angleton oversaw a spy ring of Jewish immigrants and Israeli operatives without proper clearances, sharing U.S. secrets that aided Israelis' global espionage. Critics argue this bordered on treason, prioritizing Israeli interests over American ones. Angleton's influence helped transform Mossad into a world-class agency and solidified the U.S.-Israeli special relationship. So I could see Angleton in the defense of Israel, or even himself being worried that JFK could uncover his possible treason. And so maybe this could be a reason that he wanted to get rid of JFK, because he could potentially go to jail or possibly even the death penalty for something like that. So maybe he or Mossad had a gunman on the Grassy Knoll or had convinced Oswald to shoot at the president. So let's talk about the possibility of a second gunman on the Grassy Knoll. So the core claims of this theory are that the fatal headshot came from the front right, meaning the grassy knoll picket fence area, and not the rear where Oswald was. This explains the violent backward and left snap of Kennedy's head seen in the Zapruder film. Witnesses heard shots and saw smoke from that area. There was a large exit wound on the right rear of JFK's head, consistent with a frontal shot, and the second or third assassin escaped in the confusion, proving a conspiracy. This theory exploded in popularity after Oliver Stone's 1991 film, JFK, and has been the single most persistent alternative to the official Lone Gunman conclusion. So there are reasons why the grassy knoll theory is not considered likely. The head snap has a scientific explanation. High-speed tests showed that a bullet striking the head from behind causes a neuromuscular spasm and jet effect. So when the brain matter explodes forward, that snaps the head backward. It's kind of like the saying, for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I know when I've shot guns in my life, it's often that when you shoot at a can, it falls forward towards the shooter. The Zapruder film actually shows Kennedy's head move forward 2 to 3 inches first before the backward snap. The autopsy and wound ballistics are overwhelmingly consistent with rear entry. If you study the skull fragments, it proves the fatal bullet came from behind. So the magic single bullet theory is not magic. There's been computer reconstruction that proved that it could go through Kennedy's neck and cause all of Connolly's wounds from the 6th floor window. And that doesn't really matter anyway, because there were 3 shots, and one of the first 2 were thought to miss the car entirely and hit the pavement. But it could be that one of those shots were the ones that hit Governor Connolly. So the magic theory doesn't matter anyway. Of the dozens of people who initially reported shots or smoke from the knoll, almost all later recanted or changed their stories or admitted confusion. No physical evidence. There's no cartridge cases, footprints, etc. that was ever recovered from the knoll or railroad area, despite immediate searches. Lee Bowers was in the 14-foot high Union Terminal Railroad Tower, about 120 feet behind the picket fence on the knoll, is one of the closest eyewitnesses to the picket fence area. He saw 2 unknown men acting oddly and something happened behind the fence, but he never saw a shooter, a gun, or anyone fleeing the scene immediately after the shots. His testimony has been heavily exaggerated by conspiracy books and films, but his original record does not support a grassy knoll gunman. There was also about 15 to 18 railroad workers and 2 Dallas police officers that were standing on the triple underpass, the railroad bridge directly in front of the motorcade, at the exact moment the shots were fired. Their collective testimony is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the shots came from behind the limousine, not from the front or the grassy knoll. 2 of the officers ran towards the parking lot behind the fence immediately after the shots and found nothing but cigarette butts and footprints. If the shooter was on foot, they wouldn't be able to leave easily holding a rifle, so their only realistic escape would be inside a car. So they didn't secure that area for about 10 to 15 minutes, which was a huge mistake. But if that was sealed off right away like it should have been, then there would be no way for them easily to be able to leave that parking lot, and it looks like there was only one exit. So if you're thinking about this in advance, you would have to put that into the equation that as soon as you shoot at a president or something big happens, that might get closed. I mean, it's super close to the motorcade, and someone could just stand in front of that exit and just be like, no cars could get by, or search your car and find out that you have a rifle in there. Despite 60 years of investigation and thousands of declassified pages, no name, no weapon, no photograph, no confession, and no corroborating documents has never credibly placed a second gunman on the knoll. Some people have maybe thought they heard more than 3 shots, but there was also a lot of echoes. Out of the 14th most serious high-level political assassinations and attempts in U.S. history, 12 were carried out by lone attackers with no conspirators involved in the actual attack. Only the Lincoln assassination and the Truman attempt had proved multiple conspirators or shooters. So it's pretty rare to have a conspiracy, and most of these guys are lone gunmen. Jack Ruby was probably a lone gunman as well. As I mentioned a bit before, on the day he shot Oswald, he had received a phone call in the morning from one of his strippers for a $25 advance because she needed grocery money and to pay rent. He grabs his dog and goes downtown. And I'm sure he wasn't happy about it because he was already broke and out of money. And that Western Union office is just a block away. And he had left his dog in the car, and he had already been in that building several times over the previous 2 days. So it's not a surprise that he would go back. Oswald's transfer was originally scheduled for 10 a.m., but had been delayed. Ruby sent the money at 11:17 and shot Oswald at 11:21, 4 minutes later. If he was just 20 or 30 seconds later, Oswald would have probably been in the car and gone. So if he really wanted to conspire to do this, he would have had to be there in advance at like 9:45, for instance. So this seems completely spontaneous, especially since he left his favorite dog sitting in the car. Unless, of course, it's a conspiracy and everyone was just waiting for Ruby to finally show up. They were like, "What took you so long, Jack?" "Sorry, I just had to stop by Western Union and I was stuck in traffic." So this seems completely spontaneous. Between the early 1800s and the morning Jack Ruby walked into the Dallas police basement, American civilians have carried out hundreds to thousands of vigilante executions. Most were organized by groups on the frontier or were racially motivated. So Jack Ruby's act is pretty unique because he's a sole gunman, but it is possible. Now, some people think because he's Jewish that maybe Mossad or Angleton or someone used him to get Oswald. And it's true that JFK explicitly threatened to cut off or seriously jeopardize U.S. political, financial, and military support for Israel, and to allow Israel to face the consequences of Arab or Soviet retaliation unless Israel completely opened Dimona to regular American inspectors to credibly prove it was not building nuclear weapons. After Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson quietly dropped the inspection demands and the threats. The issue was essentially never raised again in the same way, and Israel is estimated to have created its first nuclear device around 1966 or 1967. To be honest, I think Israel is capable of doing something like this and has done a lot of bad things in the past, especially if something like this happened in more modern times because there's more modern technology and things like that. But during the JFK assassination, Israel had only been a country for about 15 years. If they got caught for doing this, this would definitely be their downfall. And the US was like their only serious major ally. They had already hid parts of the nuclear reactor from inspectors. They set up fake control rooms and had hidden elevators behind walls that went far into the basement. So before the assassination, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion had resigned, probably just to buy more time, because by the time you get a new prime minister, they have to restart negotiations. So I think they would play some kind of political games. So I doubt they would enlist the help of these two nutcases if that could be the downfall of their nation. I think the nuclear weapons was no doubt super important. But up until that point, they were able to hold the Arabs off. So, I mean, they could just play political games for a couple more years, and they would have been able to get them. And if they or anyone in the CIA wanted Oswald to kill JFK or be a patsy, why wouldn't they just pick him up from somewhere afterwards? Like, they could tell him that they have a plane waiting for him somewhere and just leave him in a 6-foot hole or transport him somewhere far away where no one will ever hear from him again? Why even put him in a situation where he might end up in jail talking to authorities for 2 days and then have to pay some other guy to possibly be able to kill him in jail, which is going to be much more difficult than him just like walking down the street, for instance. And like I said, it seemed like Ruby's plans were totally spontaneous. And I don't think that Oswald had long plans to do what he did either. He probably made the decision to do what he did the evening before when he tried to get back with his wife and she rejected him and he left the ring with her and $170. And he knew that there was a great opportunity the next day to make a name for himself. So I would go as far to think that there's a small possibility that someone instigated Oswald to do what he did. But I don't think that there's a very vast conspiracy theory where there's people in the CIA or FBI or the mafia or Cuban exiles and all of these different people working together like in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. I don't think anything like that would have happened. But there could have been a few people that pushed him in that direction. I think that's fair enough to say that that's possible. I think the conspiracy theory is popular because it's way more interesting and cinematic. Shadowy men in smoke-filled rooms, the CIA, the mafia, LBJ, and Cuban revolutionaries. People want a story that turns a senseless tragedy into an epic story. Good versus evil, secret cabals, revenge for the Bay of Pigs, protecting the nuclear program, the deep state striking back. It gives the chaos meaning and villains you can hate. And it made an awesome movie for a reason. The Lone Gunman theory is depressing and random. Lee Harvey Oswald was a profoundly isolated man, someone who was never taken seriously by anyone, and who seemed to have neither desire nor the ability to form real friendships. If Oswald had been charismatic, well-connected, or even moderately well-liked, it might be possible to imagine people willing to conspire with him. But there is simply no evidence of that. Contrast him with someone like Allen Dulles, who spent decades cultivating thousands of contacts, friendships, and intelligence relationships. Dulles was a kind of man who could pick up a phone and move the world because people trusted him. If he had been as socially toxic as Oswald, he would have never risen to run the CIA or even keep a job tending bar. Oswald lacked the one thing that is absolutely essential for anyone who wants to be part of a serious conspiracy or revolutionary movement: a large, trusting social circle. He never understood that being in the fight isn't just about ideology or dramatic gestures. It's about relationships built slowly, over years, through shared risks, favors, and proven reliability. Revolutionary groups, intelligence networks, and even criminal organizations don't let lone oddballs walk in off the street and join their inner circle. That's not how trust is built. Trust takes years of vetting, introduction, small tests, and demonstrated loyalty, none of which Oswald ever had the patience, charm, or social access to achieve. When Oswald burst into the embassies demanding visas, the Cubans and Soviets smelled desperation and instability on Oswald from a mile away. To them, he wasn't a comrade, he was a walking red flag. Both Oswald and Ruby knew they were destined to be forgotten. Oswald had no real friends, no steady job, no future, just a bitter loner who couldn't even support his own family. Ruby, a failing strip club owner drowning in debt, was soon to be just another broke nobody. They shared the same fear, dying insignificant. Oswald said he wanted to be remembered in 10,000 years, and he probably will. Ruby killed the assassin on live television to escape obscurity and prove Jews had guts. Two desperate, invisible men who didn't need a conspiracy, just a rifle, a revolver, and one moment each to make the world remember them forever. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.